Let me go ahead and turn that on. So first of all, in terms of the government, our Constitution, 1787, they create this document. That's a long time ago, right? However, we still call it the supreme law of the land. It still applies today. It was short and simple. They left enough room for interpretation. So for example, we didn't have things like TV and cell phones back then. And that's something we have to interpret into what's defined in our Constitution. Okay, so how we flesh that out, it's very versatile, but how we understand what's in our Constitution certainly is something where we have case law that helps us understand what is actually included in it. So for those of you that are interested, again, because this is a high level, I always have links to more information. The National Archives have great resources. You'll see here a copy of our Constitution. And for anyone who's like, hey, I just really can't see that and I want to see the real deal, I have a copy of it right here. I'm going to pass out. You can take a look at it. So not super lengthy. You'll notice the Bill of Rights comes after it. You'll see some more of our amendments, but that is our Constitution. So anyone been to Philadelphia to see where this was actually created? Raise your hand nice and proud. It's neat, right? It's only about an hour and a half away. You live in a great city for this kind of thing, so I hope you go check it out. So what happened was America comes to be, and they finally get some freedom from England. It's 1783, and they start realizing, like, hey, we have this thing called the Articles of Confederation, but it's not working. There was no actual money to help the government actually do the things it was trying to do. They didn't have a way to raise money, and that's why they got these 55 people together in Philadelphia, and they said, you know what, we need to do something, we need to amend what's currently our Articles of Confederation. Instead, they said, scrap this, let's just start over, and they became the framers of our Constitution and created a new document. Okay. So what that document did, in terms of our class, what's important is it created 3 different branches of our government here in the United States. So the first article talks about the congressional power. Okay, so you'll see here, Article 1 creates 2 houses that you probably hear about in the news, Congress, right? So the first house is the House of Representatives. There's about 435 representatives in that house. The number of representatives vary based on each state. A state like Rhode Island will not have as many representatives as a state like Texas that has a larger population. Whereas in the Senate, each state gets 2 senators. In D.C., just because it's near here, they say D.C. is taxation without representation. Why do they say that? So they have someone there but not able to vote in the Congress, and so that's why you'll often hear them say that. I just wanted to point that out because some of you live in D.C. Okay, so Article 1 provides our Congress certain powers. You'll see one of them is to create and enact a law. And we can see new laws being made through the Congress. You will get a chance to see how this process works next class, how the law is actually made. It's a lengthy one. They can also do things like impose taxes. Okay, so we see a lot of tax changes happening right now. They can spend money. They can create copyrights. And they can also support the military, and it is Congress that gets to officially declare war. You will see that some of these powers kind of cause a conflict with other branches of our government. Here is an example of that. So Congress gets to declare war. You'll see in a moment our executive branch under Article 2, our president gets to be our commander-in-chief. So while he's not able to officially declare war, he has a lot of control over our troops. So you'll see people sometimes stepping outside the boundaries of their powers, and that's where you'll see some controversy in the news. We also have the right, our Congress, to regulate commerce with other nations and also between the different states. So the big thing you want to pay attention to is the substantial effect rule. This is something you want to take notes on, something you might see on the exam. Congress may regulate any activity that has a substantial economic effect on interstate commerce. And so essentially, any type of business activity that involves a couple of the states at least, Congress has control over that. Okay? So the national government's power is only limited by what's listed in Article 1, Section 8. Now, Article 2 gives our executive branch some powers. So this is where we see our president. I'm sorry, I need to update this to our newest president, President Donald Trump. I don't know why I saw Obama on there. Article 2 defines the powers and responsibilities of the president. So it lets us know what our executive branch gets to do. Here you'll see the president gets to do appointments. So federal judges, like on the U.S. Supreme Court, now remember, they get to be on that court for life. But if someone passes away, we saw Justice Scalia pass away recently, the current president gets to choose who will then be nominated and appointed for that court. Legislation, the president and his advisors actually get to propose bills. Again, we'll see this process in our next class, but they get to propose the law as well. The president also holds a right to veto bills that come up through Congress. We'll get to see that in more detail later on. The president also coordinates a lot of foreign policy, and again, you'll see here, he serves as commander-in-chief of our military. He can't declare war, though. That's Congress's power. Now, the last branch is Article 3 of our Constitution, which creates the judicial branch. That's more of what we handle in our class. Article 3 creates that Supreme Court, the highest court in the U.S., and it permits Congress to create lower federal courts as well. So we saw a little bit of the difference between the federal and state courts. This is where the federal courts get created. There's two different types of processes we see in those federal courts. There's adjudication. So they hear things like civil and criminal cases we'll be talking about in this class, as long as they're within their jurisdiction, their power to hear it. They also do judicial review. So federal courts can say a statute is unconstitutional if it causes any type of a conflict. You'll see here the Supreme Court has had a lot of different levels of judicial activism. We'll see an example of that today. The way that they interpret the Constitution can make a big impact on how our society actually operates and what a law really means. So for example, there was a federal law that created the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, and it said you can't discriminate against these 5 groups. One of the groups included gender, so sex issues. The courts interpret that to also include things like sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, and any other kinds of same-sex issues. Now, because we have these 3 branches, our government has what's called a separation of powers. What that does is it tries to provide a bit of a check and balance to these 3 branches so that one branch doesn't have so much power that they can cause big issues. So you'll see here things like the legislature has the power to make and change laws, but then our executive branch is putting those laws into action, and in fact the president can veto those laws even when the legislature creates them. While the president can veto the law, the legislature then has the right to, with a 2/3 vote, turn a proposed law into law anyway. So a lot of different checks and balances to try to make sure one branch doesn't end up with too much power. Now, federal and state law. There's a couple things that are important in terms of federal and state law in our current society. One is same-sex marriage. We'll talk about that. The other is marijuana. So we're going to talk about drugs today as well. Okay? We see a lot of changes happening at a federal and state level in those 2 areas. So first of all, what is the supremacy clause? What does it tell us? Go ahead, Sean.
Federal statutes and federal treaties are supreme law.
They're the supreme law of the land, so an easy way to think of that is they win. If it's a federal law and a state law is conflicting, they win. So I talked about an example of really early on in the semester when we first started class of the federal minimum wage. Federal minimum wage is $7.25. If I choose to pay my workers $5, am I conflicting with federal law? What if I pay them $10? So federal law, if the state law conflicts with it, it can be deemed unconstitutional. If Maryland says you have to pay your workers $5 an hour, well, that doesn't meet that $7.25 minimum the federal law put forth. So we have to follow federal law within the states, but we can be stricter. We can add to it. Okay, so many states say let's pay more than that federal minimum, which is why we see a higher rate in Maryland as a whole. Go ahead, Mikey.
So could a company technically pay the federal minimum rather than Montgomery County's minimum wage?
They cannot. Okay. However, there are a lot of interesting caveats to that. So you'll also see differences in the minimum wage, not only based on the state level, but also based on county. So state level in Maryland right now, it's $9.25. Just changed recently, I think back in July to that level. And you'll see, certain institutions, like I work for University of Maryland as well. We pay people working for the college $9.25. That's a state minimum for the state school. In Montgomery County, we have a much higher rate. And so if a business is operating here, they should be paying you higher rates. However, some businesses operate in various counties, and they might argue, hey, I'm in this other county doing business, and try to not pay you the rate. So it's important that you check in with them if you think you're not being paid correctly. If you're being paid $7.25 here in Montgomery County, you're probably not being paid fairly. So state law only will prevail if there's no if there's no conflicting federal law. So an example of that is same-sex marriage. This is where we saw a big change very recently. The Defense of Marriage Act was a federal law from 1996 that basically said states can refuse to recognize same-sex marriage, so you can't get the same benefits. So what happens is, if Massachusetts is where I'm from, that was one of the first states to recognize same-sex marriage. If I go and I marry, we'll say, Mary. Me and Mary, we get married in Massachusetts. Wow, I made that hard for myself. So Mary and I, we're getting married, and it's a same-sex marriage back in Massachusetts, and then we move to somewhere like Virginia. This law made it so Virginia doesn't have to recognize we're married. So there's certain benefits you get from marriage. Besides my lovely husband I have, and he's a nice guy, you also have some financial benefits. You can be on each other's health insurance. If I die, he gets stuff automatically that I have. He gets things like, my bank account, if there's some money in there. Because Virginia would not recognize the same-sex marriage, you would not get the same benefits. So what happened was they had a lot of cases going on around this. Different states were saying we recognize same-sex marriage. The first time it went up to the Supreme Court, they said, that's great, we're going to just leave it to the states to decide. It's not a federal issue, we're going to leave it to the states. They kept having issues about this. There was different results in the circuit court. Finally, it went up to the Supreme Court again, and you can see in 2013 they found DOMA unconstitutional. So what this did was they had a case where it was kind of an older woman. Her spouse had passed away, and she wasn't able to handle, her affairs. She had died, and she just didn't have those benefits you have as someone's spouse in a normal marriage. And so she's going, well, this isn't fair. And so she was being harmed and was able to bring a case to the court. A number of other people brought their cases to the Supreme Court. And here they decided in June 2015 in this amazing threshold U.S. Supreme Court case, you know what, we are going to recognize same-sex marriage, and it should be recognized in every state. So if you're interested in that, way more detail in freedomtomarry.org. You can go check out more information on that. Now, the other way we see a conflict, which sometimes helps my students, is talking about marijuana. I know it's early, let's talk about the drugs, right? So at a federal level, is marijuana legal? No. Okay, so there's a federal law that says it's an illegal substance. At a state level, in some states like Washington, like Colorado, like Alaska, is it a legal substance?
Yes.
Yeah, in fact, some businesses can actually sell marijuana. Okay, so not only is it legal, it's okay for businesses to grow and sell marijuana. At a federal level, it's still not okay. So it's a weird area right now. It's an emerging market. These businesses are doing well. And it's certainly causing some changes, but at a federal level, it's still against the law. So is there a conflict? Yeah, so at some point we could see a case getting brought to the U.S. Supreme Court where they're saying, you know what, marijuana is illegal. And the law in Colorado that says it's totally legal and businesses can sell it and it's okay for recreational use is therefore unconstitutional. It violates this federal law, and we could run into an issue where the courts might agree. Now I'm getting hands about this. Dustin?
Could they technically do that now because of interstate commerce?
Yeah, they too. Absolutely. So we're waiting for, we're in this weird kind of middle period where so far it's against federal law. States are starting to make changes. The same thing happened in same-sex marriage. We saw kind of one by one each state instituting these laws in direct conflict with federal law. And someone just needs to bring a case, and eventually they'll decide, the Supreme Court or the highest level circuit courts, is this indirect violation of the federal law? And if they say, yeah, it is, the federal law stands, Colorado law gets struck down, those businesses will no longer be able to operate legally. Because of this, we see issues. This will come up later in the semester. There were a bunch of fires happening in California where it was legal. So people who were growing marijuana, their farms were not insured. The fires wiped out the marijuana farms. They had no crop left. It really impacted their business. The Federal Emergency Management Administration, FEMA, which would help you in these situations, would not help because at a federal level, it's still illegal. There are many banks and insurance companies that won't help these businesses because of this kind of gray area. So it's an interesting part of our business field right now because technically they're violating federal law even if it's okay in the state. So it's a weird area. If you guys want another example of that to look at, the marijuana changes are definitely something big going on right now. So in terms of the Interstate Commerce Clause, this says, hey, it's okay, Congress can regulate commerce with foreign nations, but also between our states and for Indian tribes. So this idea of the substantial effect rule I mentioned earlier is that Congress can regulate any activity as long as it relates to business between the states, basically. And a lot of things do. So I have an example of that, just to try to help illustrate this for you. This was a case that actually happened. So imagine that I told you I'm from Massachusetts, and I decide I'm gonna have a farm, I'm gonna grow corn, I'm gonna give my corn away for free. Does that seem to have a substantial impact on interstate commerce? Raise your hand if you say yes. Got 2, 3 hands. Everyone else says no. Raise your hand if you say no. I got a few, and the rest of you are hopefully paying attention anyway. So why would you say it does have an impact on interstate commerce? If I just say I'm giving away corn in Massachusetts, why does that matter to states like Vermont and New Hampshire and Connecticut? Claim about competition. What would happen with the competition?
Like the prices would go down.
Okay, so really good point. The prices could go down in those other states, right? There's a free resource, so everyone's going to go get the stuff for free. Maybe they'll drive half an hour across the border and get the free corn. How else could there be an impact? Go ahead, Jenny.
The other companies will just lose business because if you're getting something for free, then they're not going to be able to sell to that state.
Yeah, so they're going to lose business in the other states, even if it's Massachusetts and I'm selling this, I'm giving away my corn for free. I'm not actually making a business sale, but because it's free, now all the other people who are actually selling corn, they're not really getting as much of a market. It's hurting the market for these other states as well.
And would the government lose revenue too, as far as taxes?
Absolutely. So it does hurt their revenue as well. So we see there can be this substantial impact on interstate commerce, even though it's just one difference in one state. Massachusetts says we're going to give away all the corn for free. Vermont's half an hour away from parts of Massachusetts, and people are going like, hey, I'm just going to go drive over to Vermont. No, I'm just going to drive from Vermont over to Massachusetts. I'm going to get the free corn. Why would I pay for it? So that's where you can see an impact. Now, the thing I want to focus on today is our rights under the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So we talked about the Constitution and how our government really works, those 3 different branches of our government, which are what? Executive, legislative, and judicial. Good, everyone's awake. The problem with the Constitution is it didn't really talk about our rights. Okay, our rights, our individual rights, they were actually something that came later. So you have them in front of you in the Bill of Rights. There were amendments to the Constitution that created our individual rights. So you'll see the first 10 amendments created what's called the Bill of Rights. We talked a lot about the 4th Amendment at the court visit. There's some inherent rights that we have in the United States because of the Bill of Rights. So if you're interested in seeing that, again, you have archives.gov. I printed it out for you so you can see it's short, simple, but it creates a lot of different privileges for us to be protected, again, from a little bit of government invasion and also to help each other. So one of the big areas we hear a lot about in the news is free speech. Which amendment does that relate to? Who knows? Thank you, the First Amendment, and it's on the screen, right? Good. So the First Amendment says what? Congress shall make no law that abridges the freedom of speech. What does speech mean? You can what?
You can say whatever you want.
You can say whatever you want. Can you do that in every country?
No.
No, certainly not. In the United States, we have to say whatever we want under the free speech.
Yeah.
What else does it mean? Go ahead, Dustin.
How you express yourself, like clothing you wear, and hand gestures you make, and that kind of stuff.
Good. So does it say anything except free speech is protected in the First Amendment? You have it in front of you. Does it say anything besides the word speech? It just says speech. But Dustin just said, hey, you know what? It's not just things you say. It's also things you wear, things you might do, what we call symbolic speech. The way we know that is through that word that starts with a P I told you was going to be so important. Rebecca, you said it loud and proud. Precedent. Yeah, precedent. Okay, precedent, those prior cases, there's been prior cases that said speech includes more than just what you're saying. It's also some of the things you do. It's things like dyeing your hair blue. Okay, it's things like burning a flag. So we see an example of that. This is one of the major cases that showed us it's more than just what we say. We're interpreting that First Amendment to also include what you do. So this case is called Texas versus Johnson. It's from 1989. Here you'll see what happened in this case. There's this guy named Johnson. He's participating in a political protest. Okay, it's right outside the 1984 Republican National Convention that's out in Dallas, Texas. At the end of the protest, Johnson poured kerosene on an American flag and set it on fire. Several witnesses not participating in that protest were very offended by him going and basically lighting the American flag on fire. At the time, Texas had a statute, Texas had a law at a state level, which made it a crime to desecrate, to ruin the national flag or one of Texas' flags, a state flag as well. Johnson was tried and convicted under Texas law, outlawing that flag desecration. He was sentenced to a whole year in jail, and he was also given a fine of $2,000. A year in jail, it's not the end of the world, but it's still time in jail that you could have your freedom. So we're going, whoa. Of course, he appeals it. It goes to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. They actually reverse the conviction. Then, they don't want to let it drop there, so it goes all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Did they have to hear this case? No. So they submit a writ of certiorari, and they say, will you hear this case? And they said, this is important. Under the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment says we have a right to free speech. Well, is flag burning part of that?
Yeah.
So if we say flag burning is part of that, is the Texas law okay? Is it constitutional?
No.
Why not?
Because
It's conflicting.
it's
Show.
conflicting with federal law.
Yeah, it conflicts with federal law. Federal law says, hey, if free speech includes symbolic speech, if burning a flag is something that's symbolic, it should also be protected. If a Texas law says you're going to go to jail for a year and pay $2,000 for doing this, it violates that protection that we have under the Bill of Rights, First Amendment. So we see here the issue in this case, it wasn't about whether or not he burned the flag. We all know Johnson burned the flag, right? Those facts are not being disputed. He burned the flag, witnesses saw him burn the flag. He was probably proud that he burned the flag, right? This was symbolic speech, it meant something to him. If we hurt this flag by burning or ruining it, ripping it, anything else we do, is that a form of speech that's protected? That's the question that went before the U.S. Supreme Court. Do we consider that to be symbolic speech? And you'll see, usually in the U.S. Supreme Court, how many justices do you need to win your case? 5 to 4. You'll see it usually splits 5 to 4. That means, how many justices does it take to change our society? Just one. It makes a big difference who's appointed to our Supreme Court. So you'll see a 5 to 4 decision. The court held Johnson's burning of the flag was protected. It was considered to be part of our protections under that First Amendment right to speak freely. And now there are certain other limitations to that, but in general, you do have a very strong right to free speech. So you'll see a lot of this in the media because we see some bullying happening online, and we see people saying things that sometimes are offensive. And so generally, you don't have a restriction. Sometimes it can be restricted by the time and place. For example, the government can say, if you're going to go have a protest on the National Mall, you might need like a permit to do so. But you can still say what you want to say. So the other 4 justices who didn't get their way in the court, that's called the dissent, right? They disagree is a good way to think of dissent. They said defendant's use of this symbol, it was not the idea he sought to convey for which he was convicted. They're saying the fact that he burned the flag was burning a flag in and of itself. It wasn't really symbolic in that sense. The interest of preserving the flag as a symbol of nationhood is legitimate. And they said it was justified. So they disagreed. And if one other justice had agreed with the dissent, we would have had a different outcome in this case and a different precedent as a result. So a couple other rights that we have under the Bill of Rights. This is the idea of due process, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the takings clause. So under our Fifth Amendment, if you look in front of you on your Bill of Rights sheet there, it says no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. What's a good way to explain due process? You had to sum it up really quickly to someone who's going, like an 8th grader.
Have to go on file.
Fair treatment.
Fair treatment, having a right to a trial, heard of that fair treatment? Innocent until proven guilty, all the things that make the process fair have to do with due process, as well as our inherent rights. That's substantive due process. So we'll look at that in a moment as well. Now, one of the things you'll see under our Fifth Amendment is what's referred to as the takings clause. You also might hear of this as eminent domain. It's this idea that our government has the power to actually take our property. So if you've lived in a home for generations and generations and the government says, I want to build a highway, and it's going to need to go right where your house is. I'm going to take that house from you. They have a right to do that under our Fifth Amendment, under the takings clause here, which says private property basically can be taken as long as it's for public use and as long as you're fairly compensated. So imagine your home's worth $300,000. The government says, I'm going to give you $500,000, we're going to take your home, we're going to build a highway. Do you seem to be fairly compensated? Does it seem like it's for public use, they're building a highway? Are you thrilled that they're taking your house? A home is very unique. Some people live in them for generations and generations. So this is an interesting power that we've given our government. Go ahead, Elon.
So you have to agree with them, like.
You don't, so you can fight back. And if you're fighting back, what are you gonna argue?
It's not just compensation.
It's not just compensation, and that's gonna be hard. You know, it's usually not a matter of them paying fairly. And I'll argue, well, we've had this for years. It's more than the $500,000 market value. You know, there's all the hand sweat that my great grandfather put into the house. It's gonna be tough. The one that's gonna be your stronger argument is this piece.
Public use.
Public use. So it's kind of easy. If it's a highway, is it probably public use? Yeah, and unless we can say, hey, there's another way to do this highway, it's probably hard to make that argument. Where we run into issues is cases like the Kelo versus New London case. So this was something that happened in Connecticut where we saw, I think I have that here for you guys. I'm going to jump back right here. So in this case, what happened was they said, we're going to take this property from all these different people who live in the city of New London. We're going to take your homes. We want to build like a mall. You can think of it like a mall. Is that a public use? Sean's right. Technically, they decided it was. Yeah, but you could argue it's not. Who usually owns a mall? Some type of business, which is a private entity. So that's the issue we saw here. You'll see the business arguing this is a public use. What are some ways that a mall could have public benefits?
Generate tax.
Is that shopping, more tax revenue for the county? Food? Yeah, it might be a place where there's a lot of food deserts where they don't have access to food. It can provide access to a grocery store. Anything else?
Like an indoor play for kids.
Okay, so like a park inside would be a way to have kids have more enjoyment. We have state and county parks that are available. Anything else? Who has to go to work today? Anyone have to go to work today? Thanks, Diane's going to work today. What does a mall create? Jobs. So that's why you're going to argue it's a public use. If you're a resident whose home's about to be taken, you're going to say no. You know, this big box corporation's coming in, they're trying to create this business. That's not public use, that's a business benefit. And it depends on the judge who's going to win. In this case, it was Pfizer company. They're a really big pharmaceutical company. They won. They did decide it was a public use that would benefit that city. In the end, they took away those homes, and it did not benefit that particular city. The mall didn't do very well. So you just see, if you're ever driving around downtown DC and you see a bunch of really big office buildings and then you see like this tiny weird looking house in the middle of it, they won, okay? They won the ticking clock. So going back here, we're gonna do an activity around procedural due process. I wanna talk to you about substantive due process before we do that activity. So due process, really easy way to think of it is just what's fair. Under substantive due process, there's some rights that we have that are so important, the government cannot take them away from us without doing a really big balancing act. So things like our right to vote, free speech, being able to travel, our right to privacy. Now, these are really, really important rights that we have inherent. And so you'll see there's different levels that the government, that our courts use to decide whether or not they can take those rights away. Now, at the highest level, you'll see under strict scrutiny, generally if it's something like race, natural origin, religion, alienage, anything like that at issue, really, you're going to be protected. Those rights are going to be in place. It's very rare the government will take them away. It's a very high burden. You don't need to know this level for the exam. I just want you to understand there's different kind of thresholds the court applies depending on the subject matter of the case, what's at issue. Under substantive due process, we have these really important rights. Some are so important that the government has to show there's a compelling, a really important reason they need to restrict that right or take it away. And usually there has to be nothing else, no other alternative way that they can meet those ends. So normally if there's some type of issue in front of the court that has to do with something like race, they're going to say, race is protected for you. This is an important right for you to have. If there's something discriminating against race, it has to be absolutely necessary that that law is in place for them to allow it to continue. At the lowest level, we'll see under minimal scrutiny, a rational basis, they can take your rights away as long as it serves a legitimate state interest. It's a much lower burden. So we just see different thresholds. I'm not going to test you on that. There's too much in the law. It's too complex for us to get through everything in a semester. I just wanted you to be aware of that. Okay, so in terms of equal protection under our 14th Amendment, that's how they look to whether or not someone's being treated fairly. It's a very high burden whether or not they'll take those rights away. I know you're getting dizzy. I'm going back now to due process because this is the activity we're going to do today. So due process, again, a good way to think of it is it's fair treatment. So the government has to go through certain procedures to ensure a fair result. Okay, the process due is in proportion to what the government is trying to take from the person. So for example, in criminal law, what's the burden of proof? Beyond a reasonable doubt. You are innocent until proven guilty. Okay? And you have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. You need 12 people, which is hard to get 12 people to agree unanimously that you did something wrong and you are guilty for you to go to jail. Because what are you going to lose if you're found guilty? Yeah, everything. If you're in jail for 30 years from the age of 20 to 50, you're losing some of the most important years of your life. The time you probably get married, have kids, have the height of your career. Yikes. That's a big thing to lose, so the burden's really high. Okay, whereas if it's something like money in a civil case, it's just money. If they mess up money, we can get the person's money back. It's not as high of a burden. It just needs to be clear and convincing. So procedural due process, it's all about what's fair. I'm going to show you an example of this today with a case study. It's on our Blackboard site that has to do with something relevant to you to help you remember this concept. Now remember, for the exams, if we spend time on something, a scenario, a case in class, you don't need to be familiar with every single case and what year it was and the name, the fact. They're just ways to help illustrate the material. But if we do an activity or we do a scenario, Glenn, like looking through the Kilo case we use as an example of the takings clause, or the Texas versus Johnson as an example of what free speech means, those are concepts if we spent more time on, they're more likely to show up in the exam. So this activity today is more likely to show up on the exam. So you'll see in this activity, this is something you might experience in your actual classes. I hope we don't have a situation like that in here. We have someone who's being accused of cheating. So what I'm going to ask you to do is get into groups of about 3, 4 people. We'll talk through the facts before you get into your groups. I want you to think about whether or not this person was treated fairly and which facts support that. And if you think they're treated fairly, great. Probably most of you will say this is unfair. What facts support that it's unfair, that it would violate their due process rights under which amendment? Fifth Amendment. So just to make this easy for everyone, again, this is on Blackboard. Our point, someone's caught cheating. They did not cheat. We feel like they're being treated unfairly. Our point is, they did not cheat, right? I'm going to say Rebecca did not cheat. She's being treated unfairly. She's wrongfully accused. So what's my relevant course concept there? What protection, what right do I have? Which law says I have a right to be treated fairly? The Fifth Amendment. So under the identification piece on the first side here, I'm going to say, under the Fifth Amendment, I have a right to due process, to be treated fairly under the law. And then send me that back. Where are the extra copies? Sorry. I think they need more than that. So that's our relevant concept. We're explaining that due process means treat people fairly. Now under the connection piece on the back, this is what you'll do with your groups. I want you to think of a few reasons why this person was treated unfairly. So here's what happens in this case. You're a senior. You're at a major state university. You feel great about a really hard exam you took in Professor Watson's class. The dean's office sends for you, and you enter curiously. You have no idea why the dean's office is reaching out to you. You wonder if your exam was actually so good that you're being awarded a prize. That's where your mindset's at. Not quite. The person giving the exam, called the exam proctor, they've accused you of cheating. Based on this accusation, you've actually been flunked in the course. That can happen if you're accused of cheating at colleges. You can be flunked in the course. You can even get academic misconduct put on your transcript. So you protest. You say, I'm innocent. You demand to know what this accusation is, and the dean says you will learn the details at a hearing if you decide to have a hearing. She reminds you that if you lose the hearing, you'll actually be expelled from the university altogether. 4 weeks of work, years of work, and your entire career are suddenly on the line. The hearing is run by this person named Professor Holmes. There's a lot of people and facts in these cases. A good way to keep them all in check, circle the key players. You could circle Professor Holmes' name and kind of underline things that seem important. Professor Holmes, he'll make the final decision. Holmes is a junior faculty member in Watson's department. Next year, Watson will decide whether or not Holmes actually gets tenure, meaning he gets to be employed for life there. And he wants that, okay? At the hearing, the proctor accuses you of copying from a student sitting in front of you. Both Watson and Holmes have already compared the two papers. They've concluded they're strongly similar. Holmes tells you that you must convince him the charge is wrong. You examine the papers, acknowledge there are similarities, but plead as best you can that you never copied. Holmes doesn't buy it. The university expels you, and they place on your transcript a notation of cheating. Have you received fair treatment? We're saying no. We're saying we have a right under the Fifth Amendment to fair treatment, due process in the law. So I want you in the connection piece on the back here, find 3 examples of where you think this person was not treated fairly, and then we'll talk together as a class. We are at 11:54, so I'll give you about 5 minutes in groups of about 3 or 4. I'll let you choose your groups, and we'll talk together as a class. Yes.